develop new funding streams through grants or fundraising, you are in the right place. Schools have experienced demands on budgets that they have not seen before, and many of you are looking for ways to support your programs beyond your PPR or per pupil revenue. You're thinking about reaching out to others for support, but you may not be sure how to do that. John and I are going to share our best strategies with you today. Here's our agenda for the day. We're going to start with some introductions so you can know a little bit about our backgrounds and who we are. Then John will share his presentation, about 15 minutes, on fundraising from board members and individuals. Then I'll share my thoughts on how to build a grants pipeline. We'll do some final thoughts, and then we'll save time at the end for a Q&A from you guys. So if you have any questions that don't get answered through the presentation, save them up, let us know in chat, and we will do our best to answer them. All right, so first we want to hear from you. For those of you who are with us now, share your name and role, and then also the name of your school, city, and state. Just throw that into chat if you can, so we know who's here and what type of representation we have.
Nice to meet you as well, Michael. See you through your welcome in the chat.
I know you're all busy, but we'd love to hear from you so we know what, if we can customize the presentation, whether you're a developer or a school leader or a board member, we'd love to know. Okay, some people might be coming in a little bit late, so should we move on, John?
Sounds good.
All right, the next thing is we'd love to, if you're here, we'd love to hear what is stopping you from fundraising and grant writing now? That might be an interesting question if you've got a minute to share with us. Hi, thank you. Middle school science teacher, awesome. New Mexico, were you at the CPICS conference last year? If you weren't, it was in Albuquerque and I was there and I enjoyed your beautiful city. All right. Well, let's see if a few more comments come in. John, let's go to introductions. Thank you. So my name is Peggy Downs. I'm a grants specialist for charter schools. Sorry. I have spent 20 years supporting charter schools. I started as a parent way back in 2000 when my oldest son was in kindergarten and we were looking for options. I'm sure many parents have had the same experience. I started as a founding parent at that school and then became a teacher. And eventually I became a director in charter schools and then a board member. I taught for 10 years in charter schools mostly, but my final year as a teacher was actually spent at the American School in Switzerland. Then I went on to become a director at 2 different schools and a board member. I also served on the board of directors for the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, and I was one of the, coordinating committee members for CPICS. So I was helping when Steve Zimmerman was leading the way to start this coalition, and I just believe it's grown to be such an amazing support for charter schools. I have managed budgets at seriously underfunded charter schools. I've struggled with fundraising, and I didn't really have faith in grant writing. Let us know in chat if you had any experience with grants, and have you felt the same kind of frustration or doubt that I did? If you have, I get it. After I left my last school leadership job, I had a chance to work with a charter school that was aggressive about fundraising and grants. That school leader was a model for me and sparked my interest in supporting school leaders in how to write grants to fund their visions. As a result, I developed my business, Granting Your Vision, and started writing about what I was learning, filtered through the lens of my experience as a charter school leader. My business is called Granting Your Vision because my focus is on helping you achieve your vision for your school. My mission is to help 100 school leaders write successful grants in the next 5 years. And as a part of that, I developed a series of books called Grant Writing for School Leaders. That's the 3 books on the top right. The book 1 is called Startup Guide for School Grants. Book 2 is Charter School Grants. And book 3 is Grant Writing for Impact. I also developed a book called Beyond Academics, where I co-authored with 7 other consultants who work with charter schools. Each of us wrote an article basically sharing what we feel are the most basic fundamental strategies for the areas that we support. That book is available on Amazon for free. All 8 of us consultants agreed that this book was a valuable resource for charter school leaders, and we wanted to make it permanently free on Amazon. So you can find that at any time and download it for free. I also wrote a book just last summer called Create Success with Classroom Grants, and that's a book for teachers, focused primarily for charter school teachers, where the teachers can work through the workbook activity by activity to actually develop classroom grants. I'm also happy to say that John here has agreed to help me write my next book. It's called Fearless Fundraising, and he and I will be collaborating on that book, hopefully coming out early next year. So keep your eye out for that one. I just this weekend topped over 1,000 books that were sold or downloaded over the last 2 years since I wrote my first book. So that was a huge milestone, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to write those books. So, John, I'm going to step aside now and let you introduce yourself and take over with your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peggy. And it's an honor to be co-presenting with you, and also to be talking to so many other school leaders here and people who work for charter schools. I know that your time is limited, and so we want to make sure that this is the most impactful lesson that you will attend, especially if you are a fundraiser or looking to build relationships or identify funds for your school. So a little bit about me. My name is John Campbell, as my profile says, and I'm a certified fundraising executive, and most recently the founder and CEO of Funded Strategies. Like you, I actually come from the charter space. I know Peggy does. We are kind of unique in this world in that we come from this space and have sat in the same seats that you are sitting in currently. And so most recently, I was the director of advancement at Eagle Academy Public Charter School in Washington, D.C., where I was responsible for securing over $5 million annually in individual and philanthropic support, both from governments, foundations, individuals. And in fact, we launched a private foundation to support the school, which I became the executive director of. Mind you, this was all with a staff of 1. So the best practices that I will be sharing are from that lens of working in small teams and understanding that time is limited, and that the resources that we have available to us may vary, but the best practices will still be applicable. During my tenure at Eagle Academy, I noticed that a lot of the other charter school fundraisers were teachers or people who might have come outside of the charter space and didn't have that education background or that fundraising background. And so I came and started a community of practice here in Washington, D.C., where a bulk of my work is for charter school fundraisers. And we get together every other week virtually now, since COVID happened, to share best practices, to commiserate, to kind of serve as a therapy in some ways about how do we grow our fundraising. And I did this because I really believe strongly, and I hope that you do as well, but that we as charter school leaders might be competitors in name, innately by the work in the way that we do and how our student enrollment works, but we're not competitors in mission. We all believe strongly in advancing our students and our scholars. So that led me to launch Funded Strategies in 2019, where I have now been leading this work as a consultant, working with charter schools across the country, authorizers, charter support organizations, education-related organizations, not just here in DC, but in Virginia, Atlanta, Washington State, and have had a number of conversations with others outside of those jurisdictions. I really, unlike other charter school or unlike other fundraising consultants, I really pride myself on being a charter school expert, which I know Peggy and I share this passion for this work and really our knowledge of digging deep into really what's going on in your work and how does fundraising connect the dots. I care so much about this sector that I actually serve on the board of trustees for Capital City Public Charter School here in the district. And in my work collectively through funded strategies, includes, it's really broad, but it includes grant writing, it includes research, it includes infrastructure and strategy. A lot of people are trying to figure out, how do we set up programs, how do we actually grow our work. I've supported capital campaigns and in 10, 12, $15 million, managed events, really pretty much anything that deals with charter school fundraising related, I can talk to or do and support schools. And that's what I think excites me the most, is that there's so many different ways that people are doing fundraising. And again, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everybody today. So let's get into the meat of this. Why is it important that we're talking about fundraising? The answer to this question might sound obvious. However, schools really fail to think about the entire fundraising landscape when we think about how we tackle this problem. When we think about fundraising landscape, we must include foundations and individuals. And the reason we include them is because in 2019, Americans donated over $64 billion, billion with a B, which was a 12% increase from 2018 to support education organizations. Yes, I know usually what I hear in this point is that the bulk of those dollars do go to higher education. And so your universities, your community colleges, your private schools. However, there are plenty of funders, both nationally, regionally, and in your communities that are supporting and giving to K-12 schools. So where does this money actually come from? Individual requests and small family foundations that typically operate as individual decision makers. And I know Peggy will talk a little bit about foundations and grants a little bit later, but they account for 85% of all charitable giving. This means we cannot ignore these subgroups when we plan for success. I want to dig a little bit deeper, because oftentimes we talk about national education numbers, we ignore what actually means for charter schools. To give you some context, last year I surveyed charter school development leaders in Washington, D.C. about where their philanthropic support comes from. Specifically, what I really wanted to know is that where was their non-governmental support coming from in any given year? And so these are the results that you have on your screen. And we weren't obviously surprised to see that most schools receive a majority of their discretionary funds that are non-per pupil funds coming from competitive state and federal grants. However, if we dig a little deeper, we can see that foundations accounted for 26% of their philanthropic support, and individuals counted for 16%. The average philanthropic per pupil support in DC was approximately $400. So every student that you had, schools were raising $400, and some schools were raising up to $900 per student that they had enrolled from philanthropy. That includes sources from board members to parents to community leaders to philanthropists to foundations. They were raising that much per student. So these are just two areas that we're all trying to grow. That's why you're hopefully joining this conversation today. And what I'm guess is that many of us don't know where to start or even how to expand this work. And so the purpose of this presentation will be to provide a roadmap to designing a successful charter school fundraising program that grows your foundation and individual philanthropic support. So how do we begin to diversify this fundraising? And and I want to talk specifically about how board members and stakeholders can really support this work. If you're a team of one, it's going to be critical that you leverage the resources that you have in your network and leverage your board members and other individuals, including your head of school, principals, etc., in this work. And I know Peggy will talk about what that looks like in the grant space. But to do this, we really need to understand the donor life cycle and how you can strengthen fundraising at every step of the journey. So first, in the donor life cycle, we identify potential donors and ambassadors of our work. And I'll give you examples of how you can actually engage stakeholders to help find prospective donors and funders. Next, we qualify them. We want to figure out, are these good prospects? Is it a good fit? Do they have an interest in giving? Does this make sense? Do they have capacity? Then we cultivate. Cultivation is where we want to know, want to get to know the prospects better. We want to determine their interests. We want to see where their alignments are. If you're a STEM school, do they really care about engineering? Or are they going to surprise you and say, no, we care about the arts? Those conversations are really meaningful. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Cultivation and stewardship, which we call banking on this donor life cycle, account for 70% of the donor life cycle. And therefore, by far the most critical pieces of your fundraising program. Then there's always the ask. This is probably the most, the most people have the trouble with, I would say. But I want to tell you one thing: it only accounts for 5% of the donor life cycle. And if you've done your work, you already know what the answer is going to be. You already know what to expect from those conversations. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And finally, we want to thank donors, and thank them again. We can't thank them enough. It costs more money to acquire a new donor than it does to actually go and retain somebody. So to support this work, I've actually outlined how your development team, school leadership, board members, other stakeholders can support fundraising along every step of the journey through this life cycle. And that's what we'll go into now. So identifying new prospects. This is probably the area that most people get hung up on. When I talk to charter school fundraisers, many of them don't know where to start to identify new donors. In fact, this was a question that I had when I went to a charter school. It's not the same as a private school where you may have affluent families who can support this work or who are used to supporting this work. It's not the same as a university that has robust alumni networks that have decades of managing these relationships. That's not always the case in the charter school world, both because of where we're at in our life cycle as a sector, but also because that's not our core mission. Our core mission is to provide really high quality education. And so identifying donors can be a challenge. So how can board members and other stakeholders support this work? They can participate in relationship mapping exercises. And I give you an example and include it in the tools and resources. You actually have the data collection tool that I use with board members. And I find this to be one of the most important things that they can do. They can host their own or invite other members of their network to school tours, and that can be in person or virtual. We know that things are virtual, and I've seen some really great virtual distance learning tours over the last couple of months that will blow your mind. And then you can invite them to other mission-related events. Finally, they can be an ambassador in the community. Our board members and our stakeholders aren't not only there to help raise dollars, they're there to help raise awareness. And so I want to make sure that we think about that and think about all of the aspects of fundraising and how they can lend themselves. So just a brief reminder that I'll call out here: don't forget about your natural constituencies that are closest to your work: parents, staff. Some of you might think, I come from a Title I school, and feel uncomfortable asking families for support. I came from a Title I school. Most of the schools that I work with are Title I schools. They serve economically disadvantaged students or diverse populations. And at the end of the day, I just wrote a blog post on this. You can go to my website and read it. But I strongly believe that we shouldn't be making assumptions for our families, our staff, our leaders. In fact, we want to make opportunities for them to participate in all facets of the school, not just around community meetings, but also through fundraising. It's a way to have ownership of your work in a real way, and it also is an equity issue. We are giving opportunities and not making assumptions about our families. So what is relationship mapping? I talked a little bit about this. I just did a whole session on this with the DC Charter School Alliance's conference on relationship mapping last month, and it gets a lot of interest. So essentially, relationship mapping is a way to visualize your school and your stakeholders' known and unknown network. By using relationship maps, we help board members and other stakeholders understand who they know and who they might know given information we collect from them. So this is not just about, I know my neighbor. This is also, who does my neighbor know? That's how we start to build these relationships. So relationship maps turn the question again of who do you know on its head, and ask things like, where do you or have you worked? What other boards do you serve on? What are your hobbies? Where do you volunteer? What community associations do you belong to? Or even Greek associations? Were you in a fraternity or sorority in your school? Who in your network do you think might be interested in this work? Asking those types of questions will get you very different answers than asking the question of who do you know, where most board members will say, I don't know anybody. We obviously know that's not right, but we know that that's all of our natural inclinations, because the idea is that people don't want you asking for money from people on their network. The idea is not to get this information to ask people for money. The idea is to start to build a network map to then start strengthening relationships, which you can then either identify as ambassadors or people that might not be interested at all, but you at least now know that information. This information is then used to draw the connections to potential funders and individuals who might have an interest in supporting your school. You can also do this on the flip. You can identify funders. And I just did this project with Ethos Classical, a charter school in Atlanta, where we identified funders. We did the relationship map. We went and asked their board members all these questions. And from that, we were able to identify connections, whether they were second or third degree connections to every single one of these funders. And I will throw the caveat in there. This is not what we would consider a traditional philanthropic board. This is not the KIP or the big charter management organization. This is a brand new charter school, just finished its first year, community-based board, and they were able to identify connections to every one of the funders that we've identified it. Not only that, but they, as of today, are a finalist. They are one of 6 finalists for 4 awards in a Chick-fil-A True Inspiration Award for $150,000 in the Southeast region. And they have that through a connection and an invitation to apply. And they got a relationship to go to the largest charter school funder in Atlanta through that relationship map. They were able to have a conversation and get an invitation. These are things that are so critical, especially when you talk about foundations who are invitation only. These relationships will help you break down those doors. Next, after we've done all this work, we want to qualify the donors. What this means is board members can review prospective donor lists. They can give you some background. They can conduct one-on-one visits. They can ask, and try to help you answer whether these people have the ability or the affinity to give. Do they care about education? Do they care about social emotional learning? Do they care about your particular model? And then do we have access to them? That's what the relationship map actually goes and answers, is do we have access, and we can draw those lines. We want to then start cultivating these. As I mentioned before, cultivation is critical in an area where board members and other stakeholders can really support this work. They can support this by joining cultivation visits, inviting their network to school-based events. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Making introductions to the head of school. The idea is that they're not going out and just saying, "Hey, friend, can you give $50 or $100?" The idea is to get them to understand the work that you're doing and invite them into the conversation. And whether that's them joining and adding some context because they share a hobby with a particular funder, or that they have a friend and they really think this is something that they would be aligned in and they want to introduce you to the head of school. These are ways that they can help in that cultivation process. The other thing that I'll call out here is just sharing their reasons for giving is so important. Our board members should be giving to our organizations at whatever level is personally significant to them. And the reason that we ask for that is because it's really difficult for them to go and ask or invite others to the organization to make a gift if they haven't done so themselves. The other thing about sharing your reasons for giving is it deepens the relationship with the board member and with that particular person that they're talking to. We now get personal experiences of why this work is important and why they should invest in it. So that is one thing that I do really encourage you all to think about, of getting some stories from your board members in this way. Finally, we get to the ask. It's not the last step, but again, it is the most dreaded, I think, for most. I still get nervous when I go in and make asks. I think most people do. And it's just the most uncomfortable process. But if you've done your work, if you've had the conversations, if you've met with these funders and these donors and have asked the questions about what do they care about and really understand, you know exactly where this is going to end up. You may need to figure out the numbers, but at the end of the day, you know whether they're in this and invested or whether they're not. And so you've done it in an intentional way. So board members and other stakeholders can really support this work by joining on solicitation asks. They can be that validator in that meeting to either open up the conversation or make it easier for somebody to come in and ask. I've often brought a board member in who had the relationship. I've come in, made the ask after they, made sure that they felt comfortable and that the funder knew who we were. They can, again, share their stories of impact. What stories resonated with them at the school level that really meant something that they can share with a funder? Again, making their own gift. This is critical that they make their own gift. I will say that probably one more time before we're done. And then they can, write proposals or make the ask. And I know Peggy will talk about strategies to engage the board and proposal writing and asking donors. Finally, they need to thank donors. Board members, this is the most fun thing that I do as a board member. It's the most fun thing that I ask my clients to do. is to engage the board in the acknowledgement process. This isn't just your tax receipt. This is that tax receipt's automatic. You should be setting that out automatically. That should be just going out. That shouldn't even be a question. Thanking, when I say thanking, I don't mean the tax receipt. I mean picking up the phone, sending a personalized note, sending a text message, sending an email, whatever that communication medium is, do it. Thank them once, thank them twice, and ask board members and your head of school to participate in that process. I will say the most powerful conversations I've had is when I've called a donor as a board member and said, thank you for your gift of supporting this. Those people will tell me why they gave, which then strengthens my investment in this work. It also gives me a story that I can use later and anecdotally to tell to another donor of like, this is why another donor gave. It's so powerful, and it takes 30 seconds. I suggest at the beginning of every board meeting, you either virtually or in person, depending on where you're at, bring together a handful of note cards and ask people to, sign a couple of note cards that are personalized to donors above a certain threshold. It's so powerful. And then finally, as part of stewardship, you want to invite donors to mission related events, whether that's award ceremonies, graduations, STEM fairs, mentor, nights, whatever it is. That's a great way to engage them. The last thing that I'll leave you with before I turn it over to Peggy, it's one thing to put all of this information in a slide and say, this is how your board members can support your fundraising work. It's another thing to be able to track and measure it. And so one of the resources that I've shared with you is a template board commitment form that not only has opportunities for them to give, but it's also a pledge form for the year. This is a Word document, so you can edit it, you can play with it, throw your logo on it, do whatever you want. I have no pride of ownership. But I want to make sure that you have something that's easy to use and a way for you to actually capture the data. The one thing that I love to do, some organizations have board give gets. I don't really like board give gets. I find that board members are going to step up to where they need to step up based on the expectations that you set. So the one thing that I say is we hope that every board member will make a personally significant gift of their own, and that is a requirement of every board member. The other piece that I do is I take all of this data that they report in these forums, I put it into an aggregate, and let's say they collectively have said, as a board, based on their forums, we will give $10,000 to the organization. We'll also introduce 50 people to the organization as whether that's to the head of school or bringing them to the events. Those are two metrics now that I can benchmark against in future board meetings and future development committee meetings. And it doesn't single any one board member out, but what it does do is it allows for the board to participate in the fundraising process in an equitable way that meets every board member where you're at, because you likely have parents on your board, you likely have community members on your board, you might have philanthropists, and everybody's going to show up differently based on what their ability is, and we want to meet them where they're at. So this form is for you to use and to make sure that you're tracking and measuring it. So I'm going to turn it over to Peggy, who's going to dig a little bit deeper into grant writing and the success there.
Great. Thank you, John. That was amazing. I love to learn what you have to say, and your perspective is so valuable. I hope people are taking notes. So I know that we've had a fairly quiet audience, but if you could, those of you who are here, I'd love to know a 1, 2, 3, or 4. Are you just starting out with grants, or like you have no experience at all? A 2 is you've written or managed a few, but you're ready to learn some more. A 3 is you have a good start, but you're not getting the results you want. And a 4 is you've been successful, but you're always looking for ways to improve. If you could just share 1, 2, 3, or 4 in chat, that would be so helpful. So in a moment, I will share a simple framework to help you manage grants. When you feel in control of the system, you can make time to write and find grants. When you don't have a good system in place, grant writing becomes a dreaded task. And I know, because I've been there. You are less likely to meet your goals, and you're more likely to just keep putting it off. So what's stopping you from success with grants? Well, I've talked to school leaders. Sometimes they say, I don't have time to write grants. I get that. I probably didn't have time to write grants myself, but if it's a priority, you can make it happen, and here's how. You build support, and you don't try to do it all by yourself. You build a network of people who are willing to help you share the load. And I see we've got a 1 and a 3 to 4. Awesome, good spread. I'll try to hit both with my tips. So that school that I mentioned earlier, where I was inspired by the school leader with all the things she did for grant writing and fundraising, the way they did it is they built school-wide support. They had teachers who were writing grants. They had parent volunteers writing grants. They had a board member who wrote grants. She stepped up and said, I will be the board member in charge of writing grants. They hired me as a consultant to write grants. Their grants administrator coordinated it all, and their director even wrote grants. So all of us were focused on filling the needs of that school. As a result, they were able to basically keep the school afloat during those first 2 years, which we know are so critical. They were under-enrolled and struggling, and grants kept them going. Other people might be saying, it's too complicated. I really don't understand grants. Well, that's why we're going to show you how to simplify the process. I worked at a school where my co-director was able to bring in a $600,000 3-year grant to serve our students. She wrote the grant, but she did it in coordination with our business office, with a board of directors member, with a couple of teachers that supported her. Again, shared the load. She was not up till 3 in the morning. Well, she might have been, but she was not up till 3 in the morning writing the grant. She was getting help, and she coordinated all of the effort. In the end, she was able to provide mental health services for a community that desperately needed it. If any of you are familiar with Aurora, Colorado, you know that it is a high needs population. She got mental health services for those students for 3 years, and the school managed the grants so well that last I talked to her a few months ago, they were submitting a renewal application to get the cycle going again for another 3 years. It can be done. You also might be saying, well, one last one. You also might be saying that a one-time grant doesn't help you. And that's true. So I'm going to show you how to build a sustainable grants program with a high approval rate on the grants you submit. I worked with a school. I was on the board of directors, and they started from day one writing and submitting grants. They got community grants. They got a Daniels grant. They got a Colorado Charter School Program grant. They worked with local businesses to get items donated to the school. They built those relationships and had a solid foundation so that by year 3, they were already looking so solid that they just recently announced they're buying the building that they've been leasing since the beginning. This is a tiny school. There's fewer than 400 kids, and I think it's grade K-8 by now. And they built a solid foundation with grants, continuous support for their school. Okay. So this is a concept map that shows you what I'm talking about. It's got the 3 components of the framework: support, simplify, sustain. But what I want to point out on this slide is the intersection between the circles. So when you build support in your community for grants, and when you simplify the process so that it's manageable, then grant writing becomes practical. Along the bottom, when you have the process simplified and you are committed to sustain grant writing, then you're able to provide consistent effort to the process. And then in the final part, when you sustain the work and you continue to build support, then you will get results. It takes a while, but you will get those results. Thanks. So let's talk about support. What does support look like? In a school with a successful grants program, you have these 4 components. You've dedicated time and resources. All members of the community support the programs funded by the grants, and your grant programs align with your school mission and vision to produce student-focused results. You dedicate the time and staff needed to manage the grants process, and that includes searching for grants, writing grants, and managing the program. That might be spread off across several people. You might incorporate a hired grant writer. You may recruit a board member to do some of this work, but you dedicate the time, and it is a priority. You have support from your community. Parents and staff members understand the importance of the grants activities and are willing to lend their support to make sure those promises are made. When you write a grant, you're making a promise to the grant funder that you will do what you say you'll do, and that you will provide the accountability and the reports at the end. And your community can support you in that effort. You also need strong leadership from administration and your board members. And this is where Regular communication between administration and the board can make a huge difference in your success in grants. Administrators and board members can provide consistent leadership and accountability for grants. They need to align their grants proposals with their school mission and vision and make sure that it is helping the school reach strategic goals that they have set. And again, related to vision, your grant proposals are calibrated to your school mission and vision. So they're not pulling you off focus onto some tasks that don't really help you meet your goals. They are 100% focused on helping you reach those strategic goals that you have set as a board and as a leadership team. So I see a few of you here ready to chat. I've got a couple more answers on my 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. Awesome. Take a moment to think now, and if you'd like to share in chat, we'd love to hear from you. Out of these 4 characteristics, what do you already see as a strength at your school? Or what is something you think you'd like to work on next? And then, John, let's go forward and we'll see what responses we get. So the second part of this is to simplify. I'm a systems person. I am all about making things simplified so that the job is easier next time. Yes, it takes more time up front, but in the end, it becomes something you can go back to easily or something you can share across multiple people. So your system is organized. The information that anyone who is writing a grant needs is available in one place. That might be a shared network drive. It could be a Google Drive. It could be a folder in your office. Whatever your system is, you've got it all in one place so people are pulling out the same information and all of your grants are reflecting the same goals, the same tone, the same kind of project activities. It's systematic. You have a single person who's coordinating it. Going back to that first school that was a role model for me, their grants administrator saw every single grant that was submitted. It had to go through her first. Even the teacher grants. So if she had 2 or 3 teachers who were writing different grants, she was able to go back to them and say, you know what? We can make this one stronger if we do this. Or I see 2 grants for the same thing, and this one is more likely to be approved. So let's hold off on yours. She was able to have those conversations because she knew what they were doing. She worked with the director. She worked with the board members. I was in constant contact with her as the grant writer. We all worked together to meet those school goals. It's also replicable. If she had walked away from that job for whatever reason, all of her systems were in place. Somebody else could have picked up the next week and just rolled with it. They would have known exactly where she was and what needed to happen next. It does take time to set up these systems and procedures. You're investing in your school's financial future. If you have any questions about that, I have a million resources on my website. I have a grants tracker. I have resources on how to find a grant, all kinds of resources, and most of them are free. So please check out my website and look for those resources. Also, I highly recommend that you establish a grant writing committee. And I know that John would speak to the idea of a development committee or a fundraising committee or a grant writing committee. I mean, they all are serving the same purpose, which is basically identify your best people who can support your school, get on the calendar so that you can have regular meetings and set some goals. So if you're interested in establishing a grant writing committee, I have a blog with tips, with questions you can ask yourself, and with some tools, for example, how to write a charge statement for a committee. Thank you. And the third one is to sustain. When you sustain your grants program, you're building for the future. Plans and projects reflect thoughtful attention to your school's long-term goals. This is a critical step that many school leaders just don't get to. Other things pull you off the grants train and you just start thinking of the daily routines. But if you can sustain your focus on the grants program, that's when you start to see results. You build it in as a routine. Grants are a regular part of your planning conversations. They show up on the agenda at your board meetings. They show up on your agenda at your school leadership team meetings. You ask your teachers who's doing classroom grants. I will be the first to admit, when I was a school leader, I had no idea if my teachers were doing grants. I usually didn't hear about it until I happened to walk in the room and I went, that's new. How did you get that? I wasn't asking those questions. You can ask those questions, find out what your teachers are doing. And once you see those teachers who are writing classroom grants, hello, they're your first recruits for your grant writing committee. You also need to make sure there's accountability. So that whoever is writing your grants, whether it's across several people, might be a committee, or if it's you, that grant writer is reporting opportunities, results, and any concerns to the stakeholders. So if it's you, you're reporting it to the board so the board knows what you're doing. If it's a staff member, they're reporting it to you, and then you synthesize and put it up to the board so they know what's going on. And then finally, it becomes embedded. It's just part of your school culture. Everybody knows we do grants. And that means people are supporting your programs and they're not resistant, because sometimes there's some extra work related to the grants, reporting requirements and so forth. But they understand why, so they won't be resistant. And they might bring grant opportunities to you that they've heard other schools got, or that they saw in a newspaper or a friend mentioned. They'll bring these grant opportunities to you because they're aware that you're interested. So I'm not seeing much chat. We've got a quiet group here today, but that's okay. We're just going to continue on. When you build your grants pipeline, you can achieve results. Again, starting at the top, build support for your grants program and simplify the procedures. That makes it practical. As you simplify your procedures and begin to sustain your grants activities, you can be consistent, and then you can get results. This system, this framework with all of the details I've talked about, is available in your documents as a checklist. So you can just check off all the things you have. Start with the things that you're close to, right? So check off the ones you know you have. Focus in on the ones that you're pretty close, or it wouldn't take a lot of work to get that. And then make a plan for how to do whatever's left. Whatever is an area in your school that you just haven't developed yet. Make a plan for that. Again, that checklist is free, and it's available in the documents. Next. And finally, I do want to share a special book. This book is available, and I've made it free for CPICs, specifically for you guys, as a link in the documents. You can only get it free with that link. It is also available on Amazon in Kindle or in paperback, but you'll get it free as an ebook, and that it lets you choose if you want Google, Nook, Apple, or Kindle, and then also a generic if you don't have any of them. So this is Grant Writing for Impact, and this section, the pipeline, is actually from this book in the last section, Extend Your Vision with Long-Term Planning. So it's 5 chapters based on, one is envision the program you want to develop, establish the systems, again, establish. Everything is about making your job easier. So I've got some great strategies in there on how to set that up. Engage partners is about working with those grant funders and building relationships with them. Execute your plans is just kind of basic grant writing 101. And then extend is really for that leader who wants to go beyond just writing the single grant and wants to reach into developing an actual plan. And that's where this piece fits in. So again, that's free in the link, or you can find it on Amazon.
Thanks. Thanks, Peggy. We did have a question in the chat that was grants related, so I thought we could throw that in now before we do the conclusion. Michael asks, is it still necessary to have a STAM designation current for your 501c3?
So that has changed, and I have not done a federal grant since they made the change, but my understanding is it's a similar process, but it's different. So you have to go back in and resubmit and get a different kind of a designation, but you do still have to get something. I can't say what the process looks like. I haven't happened to do a federal grant since then.
Great. Yeah. And it's been a couple of years since I've done a federal grant, but the last I remembered is we just had to go in and refresh and update our profile. We already had a SAM registration. It was required of our state, our district grants.
Yes. I think that they just make you renew that and get the new designation, whatever it's called.
Yes. But thanks for that question, Michael. So feel free to start throwing your questions in the chat. We're going to wrap up here and give some conclusions and ask a couple of questions of each other. And then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have, whether they were addressed in the conversation or you have something completely unrelated, but it's related to fundraising. We're happy to have that conversation. We can both draw on some different experiences. So, what we hope you take away from this is that there are so many different opportunities to raise money for your school, and that we need to think strategically about this. And so throughout this conversation, we provided some examples of how you can include board members, stakeholders in the fundraising and the donor lifecycle and the fundraising process. Peggy shared some really great examples of how you can set up a grants program for success, because we know that still the lifeblood of a lot of schools is a grants program, whether that is competitive in government or whether it's private in foundation. It's still critical to the success. And then hopefully you walk away with, if nothing else, all of the resources that we shared. I know Peggy and I have so many other resources. Check out our websites. There is nothing that you have to do to get the resources. These are free. We strongly believe in this work and in this sector. And so feel free to read the blogs, read the resources, take the tools as you need. I know I have other webinars that I've posted and done on relationship mapping and other things. So check it out. We want you to use us as a resource. So, Peggy, before we jump into questions, I'd love to hear from you. What is the most important thing you hope our viewers will take away from this session?
Thanks, John. I think the most important thing is just that it can be done. It's going to look different for every school situation, and the balance of how much you focus on grant writing versus how much you focus on development and fundraising will be different for each of you, and probably different depending on the years. But it can be done, and it's worth it to put the systems in place now so that you can build for your long-term financial viability. And so, John, on a related note, what are the next steps that school leaders should take if they're interested in following up on grants or fundraising?
That's a great question, Peggy. And I think that you talked a lot about investing in the infrastructure. And I think that that is a critical piece of success, whether that's through your grants infrastructure or databases. But the one thing that you can really do and take away from here is to start to prioritize fundraising. And I know that's a really heavy ask, and it's really tough, especially when all of our attention is drawn away from figuring out how to do distance learning and setting up learning management systems and training teachers and bringing students in or not. There's too many things going on. I get it. But if we start to take an hour a week, I have a brand new school doing exactly what you're doing. They have a leadership team of 4. That includes their teachers, that includes their head of school. And at the end of the day, they have an hour every Tuesday that they dedicate to fundraising, whether that is meeting with me, calling donors, setting out thank you notes, looking at grants to be available, writing something. I mean, that 1 hour a day, I'm telling you, if you prioritize it, you will be able to actually move some of this stuff along. We know it's daunting. We know there's a lot. We try to help you and provide checklists for every step of the way, but that 1 hour a day is the first step in the right direction. So with that, we want to see if you have any questions for us. We could certainly answer any questions for now. We have another 10 minutes or so. And here's our contact information. If you have more questions, reach out to either one of us. I don't want to speak for Peggy, but I'm sure it's true. Both of us are willing to have conversations with you.
Oh, absolutely.
To hear what you're doing, to give some free advice. I love to hear what the schools are doing, and to figure out how we might be able to be helpful. But even if you just have a simple question or a complicated one, reach out. We're here to be a resource and to be supportive. But while we have you here, take advantage, pop your question into the chat, and Peggy and I will be happy to answer them as they come through.
Even if you just want to talk through, hey, I'm thinking about this. I wonder if there's a grant for that. I would love to talk to you. Some of my favorite conversations are learning about your schools and hearing what your needs and goals and priorities are. I had a conversation last month with, where was he? I think it was in Ohio, Minnesota, and it was a school with 97% ELLs. And I was like, wow, that is a special population. There are grants for you. So he's off on his way looking for grants right now, and I hope to hear from him again soon so we can continue the process. So I'm 100% open to just being here and supporting for you guys.
Great. And we'll give you a couple minutes to put your questions in the chat. We'll hang out here for the next 10 minutes or so to 3:30. But before you jump off or you leave, if you have to run to something, I know we're all busy. I just want to personally thank you for for joining us today, for
Mhm.
taking the hour out of your day. This is one step to making that 1 hour a week, but
Yeah,
taking that hour out of the day uh, to learn something. And we hope that you did learn something and that you have something to take away from this conversation.
nicely put. So, John, should we, while they're here and still listening, let's talk about the book that we're going to write together.
Yeah, great.
So, I've got it mapped out. It's called Fearless Fundraising. It's going to be a 30-day challenge for charter school leaders. And then when CPICS asked if John and I could work together to do this presentation, it was a match made in heaven. I was like, this is the person I need to help me write my book. So John has graciously agreed and will be co-authoring it. So he's going to lend his experience in fundraising, and I will focus on the piece of, yeah, but this is what school leaders do, and this is what is likely to be the most important information they need. And it'll be written as a series of daily tasks you could do in 15 or 20 minutes a day, every day for 30 days to build a complete fundraising program, including grants.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this opportunity, about the checklist. I'm working on with a client right now that has dedicated that 1 hour, and we're trying to figure out, once we get the program set up, what are the checklists that we can do in that 1 hour, and how do we
Mm-hmm.
create recurring tasks over the course of the year to make sure that you're not letting anything fall through the cracks. And
Right.
that there's so many things going on. We know that your attention is drawn from so many things. So let's make it simple for you because it doesn't have to be complicated. Let's boil this
Yeah.
down to what are the core components.
There's a phrase I heard, and it was applied to something else, but it applies to grants as well. Grants are not easy, but they're simple, right? It's not easy to write a grant, but the process is not actually all that complicated. If you have your charter, you've got your website set up, and you've got some basic documents that every school has, like your organization chart and your resumes of your leaders and your 501c3 letter. You put all that into one place, you've got everything you need for most smaller foundation grants. It's not that complicated. Are major federal grants complicated? Yes, of course. That's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that reminds me, just thinking about fundraising, and I think most people look at fundraising as the task that nobody wants to do. It's
Right?
about asking for money, and at the end of the day, what I want to stress is that it's about relationships. If
Mm-hmm.
you're a teacher, and I know that we had some teachers on earlier, you're building relationships with your students. If you're a principal, you're building relationships with your parents and your community and your teachers and your students. If you're a school leader, you're building relationships. This fundraising is all about those relationships, and it's not just about how do we build relationships, because it comes naturally to everybody on this call to build relationships. That's why you're in education. That's a core component of quality education. But it also is, how do we do it systematically? How do we make sure that we're thinking strategically about it? And that, I think, is where Peggy and I come in. But I always like to
Mm-hmm.
demystify fundraising, and that it's about relationships. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just, what would you want? How would you want to be treated? How would you want to be approached if you
Yeah.
were making a financial gift to something, or if you just wanted to learn more about the cool work that you're doing? I mean, that's how I get involved in a lot of things. Somebody's like, "Hey, did you hear about this great project?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And then somehow I'm making a $50 gift or $100 gift or something. But it because it's infectious. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the piece that I hope we can capture in the book, and in other pieces about relationships, and how do we make this systematic, and thinking through how do you do that in a piecemeal approach.
Right. And related to that, for grants, relationships also apply to grants because it's not necessary to always go off after those national or federal grants. You can build relationships with grant funders right in your community who probably already support the students you're serving and their families. And when you reach out and meet that board member or that CEO and start connecting with them and bringing them into your school to find out what you're doing and learn a little bit what they're doing, those partnerships can become beautiful, long lasting funding relationships, but they start with the relationship.
That's absolutely right. Um, And I hope that we use the relationship mapping tool as a way to identify those relationships, to tie that
Perfect.
back in. But yeah, I mean, it's true. It's uh, everything's about relationships. Sometimes it's hard to figure out where those relationships exist or what they are. But everybody in your community is talking to somebody else, whether that's their significant other, their kids, their neighbors, their dentist, the other boards that they serve on. It relationships are key, and I think to both of our work, whether it's foundations or individuals,
Mhm.
it does matter. So I'm glad that we were able to highlight that.
Excellent. So, John, what are some projects you've got coming up that people might want to hear about?
Yeah, I am getting ready to jumpstart a pretty big project with a charter school here in DC. We are building out all of their fundraising infrastructure. So, policies, procedures, database, kind of auditing where things have been, getting them ready for growth. They anticipate growing in the next 2 to 3 years. And so they know that they need to start building out that infrastructure and building out what are the strategies to strengthen the relationships that they have. So research, it's pretty comprehensive. We're jumping off December 1st, and I am I'm looking forward to it. Also looking forward to taking up a lot of time, but it's exciting because I think now is the time for schools and school leaders to invest in some of these things, where these things can happen parallel to what you're doing, especially if you're thinking about growth. I have another client that we're supporting. We are helping build out the strategy for a $12 million capital campaign because they're building a whole new school, and you know that's a lot of money. And so we're trying to figure out how to get there, build those relationships, and think about strategically what next year or 2 years look like to be able to build that. But they started that conversation 2 years ago, and so it takes time to
Mhm.
invest in these things, making sure that you're set up for success, have the strategies, whether that's building a successful grants program, whether that's, the individual pieces. And the infrastructure matters. And I know that you called that out, Peggy, but those are the things I'm excited about. What about you?
Well, the thing I just finished was I was able to work with the CSP grants in Colorado. Colorado runs a state entity grant, so they approve their own grants. And I was able, even though I'm currently in Utah, I was able to, thank goodness for modern times, remotely work with a team. We had a grant writer, I think she was in Minnesota. We had a school leader in Colorado, and then myself, and we reviewed several grants and were able to submit our recommendations for the Colorado program. If you are thinking about writing a major grant or a federal grant, my tip for you is don't just say what you're going to do, explain how you're going to do it. We were taking points off right and left because we're like, well, that's great. You said you're going to do it, but how? What does that look like in your school? How is that different from what the school down the street is doing? Why should we care? So, how? Be sure you include how.
I remember I wrote a federal CSP grant when I was at Eagle Academy, and we were one of 12 charter schools nationally that secured the grant. And that there's a lot of how. There's a lot of
Yeah.
how. But the great thing, this is the trick that I will tell you about the CSP grant if you're going to apply federally. Go to the U.S. Department of Education Charter School Program website. They have
Mhm.
all of the awarded applications there. You can see the application that I wrote. You can see all of the other applications that
Mhm.
schools and states have written. And you can really get a sense of what they're looking for, how it fits with your program, what might be, helpful formatting. I mean, if you've never written a federal grant before, sometimes it's down to like figuring out the formatting and how do you submit this.
Mhm.
Um, that's they do the work for you in providing those templates and tools that make it easier. I will tell you that was immensely helpful to my work when I wrote that. We were
Mhm.
able to secure just under $1 million to support salaries.
Oh,
Salaries
nice.
that we were already anticipating to pay. As part of our growth strategy, it was $1 million in the bank. So it's a great opportunity. Now we have a CSP grant in DC, so it's a little different,
Yeah.
but it's a little easier than Colorado. It's not competitive.
Oh, it's very
Um,
competitive. It was
yeah,
intense.
we have 68 individual charter schools educating nearly 50% of the students, public school students in the district. So there's not as much growth, if you will. It's
Yeah.
kind of it's been around for 20 years plus, so it's a little older market. But yeah, it's CSP grants are great. If you need federal dollars or state
Yep.
dollars, they can be really helpful to growing and expansion.
And we are getting the notification that we're going to get kicked off in a few, so we should say goodbye.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks, Peggy, for co-hosting,
My
and
pleasure.
feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, everyone.